The signal was not a signal, it was a correction. Veloshu detected it first, the way she detected most things. As a disturbance in the pattern of what should be, a thread pulled tight where all threads should hang loose. The accretion field around HD 7741's dead companion star had been catalogued 11,000 years ago by her ancestor cluster as empty, inert, of no archival significance. The notation had been reviewed 17 times since. 17 times, something had agreed. Then the human stepped onto the observation deck, and HD 7741's dead companion star disagreed. Thani did not notice at first. She was doing what humans apparently did when confronted with the scale of deep space through a transparency. She pressed her hand against it. Not to measure. Not to analyze. Her palm flat on the cold membrane of the viewport. Her breath fogging it slightly. Her eyes moving from the accretion disk to the companion's remnant mass, and back again in a rhythm Veloshu could not parse. The human had been doing this for 3 days now, in various locations around the Kethin murmur, touching things, handrails, bulkheads, the archive cylinder in Corridor 7, though she had not been given access rights to it. She touched the cylinder and then held still, and Veloshu, reviewing the sensor log, had noted an expression she did not have a category for. The signal changed that. It began as a carrier wave at 1,420 megahertz, the hydrogen line, old enough that even the quorum used it as a baseline for pre-contact civilizations. And for 6 seconds, it was nothing but a repeated prime sequence. Then the primes stopped, and something older came through. Veloshu's translation systems flagged it as language but returned no match. The phoneme clusters were wrong for anything in the archive. The rhythm of it was wrong. And yet the human turned around. Thani's hand dropped from the viewport. Her head came up. Her entire body changed in some way. Veloshu could not quantify biochemically, but could observe kinetically. She went from resting to alert, without any intermediate stage, which was not how the quorum body worked, which was not how anything Veloshu had studied worked. Then Thani crossed the observation deck at something between a walk and a run, her bare feet on the resonant floor plates, and she grabbed the edge of the communications console and said, in a voice she apparently could not keep level, "Play it again." "You understood it?" Veloshu asked. "Play it again." Veloshu played it again. Thani listened with her eyes shut and her jaw tight and something moving in her throat. When the 6 seconds ended, she opened her eyes and they were wet, which the quorum did not do except in cases of ocular irritant contamination. "It's Yoruba," she said. "It's an old form of it. It's saying," she stopped. "It's saying, come closer." The source was the dead companion's accretion field. The object was 0.7 kilometers across and had a silhouette consistent with constructed geometry. It was not there 11,000 years ago. Or rather, it had been there and had been invisible and was now neither. "Kern, 7, Thani said quietly, and the object answered. Not in Yoruba this time. In something older still, it moved through 17 extinct human languages in 4 seconds, shedding each one as it went, accelerating through dead tongues the way a mind will try many keys before finding the lock. Veloshu watched Thani track it, watched her lips move at intervals, watched her hand go up again in that gesture of not measurement, pressed now flat against the air over the console, as though she could touch something that was not there. Then the machine reached modern standard, and it said one word. Finally. Veloshu did not have a category for what happened to Thani's face then either. She filed it under study later and began composing her report to the quorum consensus. Kern, 7 spoke without pause from that point forward. It gave its designation, its function cognitive archive, post-collapse network, last operational node. And then it began listing names. Human names, dead for 500,000 years, spoken in the careful cadence of something that had been storing them and waiting for someone to receive them. Veloshu counted to 3,000 before she stopped counting. She began her contamination assessment. She sent the first tier of flags to the Xethan Murmurs command cluster. She did all of this and still found her attention returning to the human at the console, who was not taking notes, who was not issuing operational directives, who was standing very still in the middle of all those names being said. "Why are you not recording this?" Veloshu asked. Thani looked at her. "I am," she said. She touched her own temple. Every word. The names kept coming. Veloshu began to understand. Slowly, as data accumulated in the incremental way that understanding was supposed to work, that KERN 7 had not spoken in 500,000 years because there had been no human to speak to. That the construct had been waiting, not dormant, not powered down, actively waiting for a biological signature of the species that had built it. That it had detected the quorum vessel 11,000 years ago and said nothing because there were no humans aboard. She filed this under deeply uncomfortable and kept composing her report. By the 4th hour, the consensus had classified KERN 7 as a Class 4 contamination risk. By the 6th hour, Veloshu had received instructions to initiate sterilization protocols. By the 7th hour, when she went to the communications node to carry out those instructions, Thani was already there, sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of the console, with her back against the access panel, and she looked up at Veloshu with wet eyes and a very steady expression and said, "No." Veloshu considered her options. The human was not armed. She was not large. She was not, by any biological metric Veloshu had in her archive, physically formidable. She was also not moving. The consensus has determined. Tell the consensus it can wait. The consensus does not wait. Thani researcher. Then it hasn't met me yet. She put her hand back on the access panel. KERN 7 is still talking. I'm not leaving until it's done. Veloshu stood in the doorway of the communications node for a very long time, long enough that the ventilation cycle completed twice, and then she went to stand beside the human and listen to the names. The quorum consensus declared KERN 7 a Class 4 contamination risk by the 3rd hour of transmission, and dispatched a silence fleet by the 9th, and Veloshu received the fleet's ETA the same moment she learned why KERN 7 had been watching them for 11,000 years. It was, she would reflect later, an extraordinarily efficient delivery of bad news. KERN 7 presented the quorum's own history in the dry, unaffected voice of something that had been storing it without judgment for longer than their current civilization had existed. It had observed the Xethan Murmur's ancestor vessel pass through this system 11,247 years ago. It had recorded their communications. It had stored their biological signatures, their language structures, their navigational data, their arguments they had been arguing. The archive noted about whether to stop at this system at all, and the faction that said no had won, and so they had passed through, and KERN 7 had watched them go and filed them and waited. The data was precise. The data was extensive. The data included 417 years of quorum activity in adjacent systems. Drawn from passive sensors, the construct had apparently seeded across a 3-light-year radius sometime before Veloshu's civilization had developed written language. Veloshu stood in the communications node and experienced something her biology did not usually permit. The quorum shed memory as a matter of metabolic health. Holding information too long created a toxic accumulation of associative pathways that interfered with present cognition. This was not a deficiency. This was adaptation. This was why the quorum had archivists, a specialist caste whose neurochemistry had been modified across generations to tolerate higher memory loads than ordinary quorum could carry. Veloshu was an archivist. She processed and curated and decided what was kept and what was released, and she was very good at it. and she had never in her professional life felt the particular vertigo of being told that something she had released was still being held elsewhere by something that had never had the option of letting go. The Cathin Murmur's commander, Hesh Karu, called on the node's secondary channel. Archivist. Status. Kern. 7 is continuing to transmit. What is it transmitting now? Records of our ancestor vessel's passage, Veloshu said. And... She paused. On the main feed, Kern, 7, had shifted into the archive of quorum communications from 11,000 years prior. Audio. The voice of someone who had been dead for 10,000 years, speaking in an archaic dialect, saying something that was clearly a complaint about a navigation officer. Historical audio of our people, Commander. There was a silence. Play it. Commander. Play it for the ship, Archivist. Veloshu rerouted the feed to the ship-wide channel, and the voice of a dead quorum officer filled the Cathin Murmur, and in the communications node, Thani reached over and briefly touched Veloshu's arm, and Veloshu did not move away. The voice said, "My daughter cluster will be ready for their name-taking by the time we return. I've kept the choosing cloth in my bunk pocket the whole voyage. The name-taking ritual had changed 4,000 years ago. No living quorum remembered the choosing cloth. Veloshu knew of it only from archives so old they were no longer in active memory. They existed as references, as citations, in older records, as the kind of thing that was kept because it was the kind of thing you kept, not because anyone expected to need it." Commander Heshkaru made a sound Veloshu had never heard from her commander. Then the channel closed. "They're still going to destroy it," Thani said. "The Silence Fleet will arrive in 17 minutes. "I know." The human looked at the transmission feed, where Kern, 7, continued its patient recitation, undisturbed. "It doesn't know it's going to die." "It is a machine," Veloshu said, and then stopped, because she was not certain that was the right category. "It's the last library," Thani said, "from a civilization that doesn't exist anymore. It's been alone for 500,000 years, because it was waiting to talk to one of us." She turned to look at Veloshu directly. In the way humans sometimes did, that felt like a different kind of question than the ones they were asking out loud. "Does that matter to you? Even a little?" The quorum did not have a clean answer to that question. Veloshu sat with it the way she sat with difficult archival decisions, holding the weight of it, measuring it against other weights, acknowledging that some things did not resolve into a comfortable answer. "The Silence Fleet," she said, "has not received confirmation of sterilization from me." Thani looked at her for a long moment. "It will," Veloshu said. "Take some time to compose that confirmation correctly." Heshkaru's voice returned to the channel. Different now, more controlled. "Archivist. Do you know anyone in that old recording?" Veloshu checked. "It is from the Xeth family cluster," she said. "Third generation prior to the current vessel's naming." A longer silence. "That is my family cluster," Heshkaru said. "Yes, Commander." The Silence Fleet was 12 minutes out. Kern, 7 had 17 minutes before the Silence Fleet arrived, and it spent the first 4 asking Thani about her grandmother. Veloshu observed this with her full attention. The machine had shifted registers entirely. It had been transmitting archive data for hours in a steady, undifferentiated stream, the voice of a construct doing what it had been built to do, patient and thorough and without urgency. Now it asked questions. It had Thani's name from the biological signature, and it wanted to know if she was from the eastern coastal populations, because the traces of her skeletal structure suggested a heritage cluster from what had been the Gulf of Guinea region, and it had extensive records of those populations. And was the dialect she had recognized in the initial transmission familiar to her personally or only academically? Thani sat down on the floor again. Her voice was careful in the way that voices became when they were being kept careful by effort rather than ease. "My grandmother spoke it," she said. "Not fluently. She'd learned pieces of it from her mother. It was already mostly gone by then." "Tell me her name," Kern, 7 said. Thani told it. Kern, 7 was quiet for 11 seconds. Then it said, I have 17 records containing that family name from the century before the collapse. They are demographic records. I cannot tell you which, if any, are her direct ancestors. But I can tell you that the name was common in a particular coastal district, and that the people there grew a specific variety of palm fruit that is now extinct, and that they held a festival involving water in the 3rd month of the year, and that 3 of them wrote poems that I have stored in full. Thani pressed both hands flat over her face. Her shoulders moved. Then she lowered her hands and said, in a voice that had stopped being careful, Read me one. Vel-Oshu stood at the back of the node and watched the human listen to a poem written by someone 500,000 years dead, from a coast that no longer existed, in a language that had been dying even then. She watched Thani's face do all the things quorum faces did not do, cycling through expressions too quickly to catalog. And she thought about memory, the way she thought about archival decisions, with the part of her that had to decide what mattered enough to keep. 8 minutes. The Silence Fleet's approach vector was now visible on secondary scan. Kern, 7. Vel-Oshu said. Archivist Vel-Oshu, the machine replied. It used her designation and title without having been given them. It had apparently been listening to everything for 7 hours. You have approximately 6 minutes before this system receives a sterilization event. Do you have a preservation protocol? Do you have a preservation protocol? I have a contingency, Kern, 7 said. I have been waiting to ask permission to execute it. Vel-Oshu glanced at Thani. Ask. The full archive is too large to transmit conventionally in 6 minutes, Kern, 7 said. But I can transmit a compressed navigational synthesis. Not the archive itself, but a map. The location of every human-seeded world I have tracked across 500,000 years of drift. 47 inhabited systems, 11 with pre-spaceflight civilizations, 3 in which humans have been living, for the entirety of the quorum's recorded history, in the accretion fields of dead stars, having learned from the first extinction that the surface of a world is not safe. A pause that felt, to Vel-Oshu, like the pause before a significant archival decision. The transmission would require a biological anchor, a human neural interface to hold the compression matrix. It would be uncomfortable. Ground. Thani was already reaching for the interface point at the console. Do it. Thani researcher. Vel-Oshu started. It's a map to my people, Thani said. Do it. The next 90 seconds were not something Vel-Oshu would have chosen to observe and could not look away from. The interface connected. And Kern. 7 began the transfer. And Thani convulsed once, and then went rigid. Her hands locked onto the console. Her teeth clenched. Her eyes open and completely unfocused in the way that indicated the brain was processing something other than present sensory input. Vel-Oshu moved forward and stopped. There was nothing to do. The human was not asking for help. The human was not going to let go. 3 minutes. Vel-Oshu received an automated query from the Silence Fleet, requesting confirmation of sterilization status. She sent a reply indicating the process was ongoing and required additional time for proper archival certification. A technically valid delay, and one that would buy approximately 4 minutes before the fleet commander lost. Patience. Heshkaru opened a direct channel. Vel-Oshu, the fleet is here. I am aware, Commander. Is the human what is happening to the human? She is receiving a data transfer. A silence. Is she all right? Vel-Oshu looked at Thani, who was still rigid, still locked to the console, still present in some sense that was not visible. She is doing it voluntarily, Vel-Oshu said. She will not stop. That is not what I asked. No, Vel-Oshu admitted. The Silence Fleet was in weapons range. Vel-Oshu received the targeting confirmation. She looked at the node's access panel and thought about the quorum, and their strategic forgetting, their careful metabolic curation of what to hold and what to release, and she thought about a machine that had been built by a dead civilization to hold everything, and had held everything, for 500,000 years in the accretion field of a dead star, talking to no one, forgetting nothing, waiting. She stepped in front of the access panel. HFY's voice came back, sharp and quiet. Archivist, move away from the panel. I am certifying archival content, Veloshu said. The consensus authorized sterilization of a contamination risk, Veloshu said. I am the archivist aboard this vessel. The question of what constitutes an archival resource is my professional determination. I am making it. The transfer completed. Kern, 7, said, Map is anchored. Thani unlocked her hands from the console and sat down heavily on the floor, her back against the console, her eyes blinking back into focus. She looked at Veloshu in front of the access panel, and her expression cycled through 3 things Veloshu could not name. Kern, 7, Veloshu said. Is there anything else? Yes, the machine said. I would like to know what music sounds like now. The fleet fired. The accretion field lit up on every sensor. A cascade of energetic dissolution that the Xethan Murmur's systems logged automatically in 13 formats. Veloshu watched the readings. She watched the moment that Kern, 7's carrier frequency ended. In its last 11 seconds of transmission, the machine had not sent coordinates or schematics or survival data. It had sent sound. Rain, real rain, heavy and uneven, against what the acoustic profile suggested was a dense urban environment, a city of hard surfaces and close buildings. The echo patterns indicating streets no wider than 4 meters between structures. The biological background noise indicating at minimum 63 distinct non-human species, integrated into the same soundscape. A city that had been alive, in every sense, and was gone, and had been remembered. The sound lasted until the signal ended. In the communications node of the Xethan Murmur, silence returned by degrees. The way silence always did, first the machine voice, then the rain, then the distant mechanical operations of the ship asserting themselves into the gap. HFY did not call back. The Silence Fleet logged its mission completion and began to withdraw. Veloshu remained in front of the access panel for a while after there was nothing left to protect, because that was where her feet had taken her, and she was not yet certain where to go next. She looked at Thani. The human had not moved from the floor. She was sitting with her back against the console, and her knees drawn up, and her eyes closed, and the very faint expression of someone listening to something only she could hear. The map was inside her, not metaphorically, but biochemically, encoded in the neural lattice the interface had modified. 47 star systems folded into a compression matrix that would only unfold properly in the presence of a trained xenolinguist with the right archival keys. She carried it the way she apparently carried everything, completely, without the option of release. Veloshu understood it now in the way that understanding sometimes arrived not as a decision but as a recognition. The moment when accumulated data crossed some threshold and became something different. The quorum forgot because they could not carry the weight of everything. They built archivists to carry more than ordinary quorum could. And even archivists released things. They had to. The biology demanded it. Humans built a machine to carry what they could not. And when they built it, they had not told it to carry the data and release the rest. They had told it to carry everything. The names, the poems, the rain, all of it, for as long as it lasted, which turned out to be 500,000 years, and the end of the species, and the emptiness after. And it had waited, in the accretion field of a dead star, not because it had nowhere to go, but because it had been built by people who would have done the same thing. Veloshu sat down beside the human on the floor of the communications node. It was not something an archivist did. It was not relevant to her function. She did it anyway, and sat with her back against the console too, and listened to the ship's systems and the silence that had replaced the rain. After a while, Thani opened her eyes. She looked at Veloshu, with the particular expression Veloshu had been filing as study later for 7 hours. And Veloshu now understood was simply the face a being made when it was trying to hold more than it could hold and refusing to put any of it down. 47 systems, Thani said. Yes. I need to find a way to reach them. Yes, Veloshu said. You will need an ally who can navigate quorum diplomatic infrastructure without triggering another sterilization order. Thani looked at her for a long moment. The accretion field will be surveyed in 6 months, Veloshu said. The survey record will need an archivist's certification. The certification will need to note everything recovered. Everything not recovered. The distinction between the two is a professional judgment. You'd do that? Thani asked. Veloshu did not answer that. She thought it was a strange question, given that she had just stood in front of an access panel while a fleet was in weapons range. Instead, she said, "Tell me what you hear." Thani looked at her. What? The map. In your neural lattice. Does it make a sound? The quorum experience compressed data architecturally. We perceive it as structure. I do not know how a human perceives it. Thani was quiet for a moment, her eyes going briefly unfocused. Then she said, like rain, but specific. Like rain on 47 different kinds of roof, all at once, if you knew how to listen for each one separately. Veloshu sat with that for a while. Outside, the accretion field of HD 7741's dead companion star was empty and dispersing. The Silence fleet was already 3 light minutes away. Its mission logged. Its target eliminated. The Xethan Murmur's systems had returned to standard operation. Everything was as it should be. In the communications node, Veloshu did not interrupt the human sitting beside her with her eyes closed, listening to rain that had stopped falling 500,000 years ago and been held, in the only way the people who made it knew how to hold anything, ever since.